lecture by Claire Whitner. My name is Henriette Katze, and I'm the curator of the Kollwitz exhibition, currently on view at the Smith College Museum of Art. And I was given the honor of introducing her.
Microphone.
Oh, you can't hear me?
A little higher microphone? No, I mean if you want to turn it louder.
Okay. Okay, where?
Okay.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. Okay, so a couple of years ago now, Dr. Claire Whitner, who at the time was the associate curator at the Davis Museum at Wellesley College, came to Smith to view a number of Kollwitz prints from our collection. And we got to talking, and we found out that we were both planning a Kollwitz exhibition around the same time. At first, I was worried that we'd both be going to be vying for the same prints, but soon we realized that this could be an actual good thing. So, especially since our exhibition had quite a different focus. While I'm not a full-time curator, and I'm usually very busy managing the Cunningham Center for Prints, Drawings, and Photographs here at Smith, I had not planned to add a catalog to my already overbooked work schedule. However, Claire, who was very persuasive, convinced me very quickly that it would be a great opportunity to do a catalog together, and so I decided to take on the challenge, and I'm so very glad I did. Well, working with Claire was such a joy. Claire is a specialist in modern German visual culture and received her PhD entitled The Visual Culture of Service, Berlin, Modernism and the Pictorial Public from the University of California, Los Angeles in 2008. In addition to her museum work, she has remained active in her area of expertise by presenting papers at conferences in the United States and abroad and publishing her scholarly work. She also, to my astonishment, speaks, besides fluent German, my mother tongue Dutch, and has actually lived in Holland, which convinced me that our cooperation and ultimately our friendship was meant to be. The Kollwitz exhibition at Wellesley, titled The Krieg Cycle, Käthe Kollwitz and World War I, focused, unlike the Smith exhibition, solely on the Krieg series, which is a series of woodcuts that Kollwitz made after the death of her youngest son, Peter. It obviously is a pivotal part of the Kollwitz oeuvre, and the Wellesley exhibition offered a wonderful selection of prints, drawings, and sculpture, including many wonderful studies for the cycle, which all can be found in the catalog. The catalog became a real joint venture in that it contains essays from professors and curators from both institutions, in addition to an essay by a German Kollwitz scholar, Annette Seeler, which Claire took upon herself to translate. Clearly, this catalog would not have existed without Claire's dedication and persistence. So after working with Claire for the last year, I was not surprised at all when I heard last week that she is to be promoted to become Wellesley's new senior curator and assistant director of curatorial affairs. So congratulations are in order. I'm really looking forward.
Thank you.
I'm really looking forward to learn more about this fascinating series of works by Kollwitz, a series about which Kollwitz wrote to her friend Roland. These sheets should travel throughout the entire world and should tell all human beings comprehensively, this is how it was. We have all endured this throughout these unspeakable difficult years. Well, Claire Whitner is here to further Kollwitz's mission by enlightening us about the importance of this powerful war cycle. I'm therefore so very happy to introduce Dr. Claire Whitner.
Well, thank you, Henriette, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Tyga, for arranging my talk today. I'm really excited to speak to you about this exhibition because I've always found the war cycle to be this incredibly powerful work in Kollwitz's career, and the opportunity to do more research on it was really a joy, and the collaboration with Henriette was fantastic. I mean, you couldn't have asked for anything better. So, a finding with Krieg cycle, Käthe Kollwitz, World War I, and the creation of an iconic print series. The Emil Richter Gallery in Dresden published the first edition of Käthe Kollwitz's seminal print cycle Krieg in 1923. Shortly before, 100 signed sets of 7 woodcuts printed on Japan paper and presented in a vellum envelope were made available to the public, Kollwitz wrote to her friend and fellow artist Anna Kruger, claiming, "No one will suppose that these 7 moderately sized woodcuts represent many long years of work. And yet it is so. In them is my confrontation with that part of my life from 1914 to 1918, and these 4 years were hard to reckon with." Kollwitz's woodcuts by no means appear to have been executed hastily, but she was probably right in believing that the 9 years she had spent developing and revising these motifs were not immediately evident in the final impressions. The images she created for her war series diverged from her earlier style. Much of Kollwitz's previous work in other media, like etching and lithography, is almost palimpsestic in nature, the outlines and cross-hatchings of earlier states not fully effaced by subsequent edits. In the 7 plates from Krieg, Kollwitz experimented with a greater economy of form. Her choice to incise her images in fine-grained pear tree wood meant that the areas of black were uniform. Little evidence of the artist's process is registered in the final impressions. Art critic Carl Scheffler described the visual impact of the 7 plates as poster-like. Pictorial posters used for advertising were relatively new to Berlin, even in the 1920s. Critics identified good poster design in terms of the speed at which imagery could communicate information to a distracted urbanite bustling through the city. As a result, the decorative curvilinear forms of Art Nouveau, popular in the late 19th century, gave way to pared-down motifs, sharp palette contrasts, and large areas of flat color. And such minimalism was intended to bind a singular image to a brand name, making a company's product or services understandable to anyone in a matter of seconds. Certainly, the pacifist message Kollwitz hoped to convey in her Krieg series was radically different from the commercial aims of contemporary advertisers. The breadth of influence she aspired to achieve with her woodcuts, however, was just as ambitious. In a letter from 1922, Kollwitz wrote to her friend, the eminent French novelist Romain Rolland, a quote that you might recognize, asserting that these sheets should travel throughout the entire world and should tell all human beings comprehensively, "This is how it was. We have all endured this throughout these unspeakably difficult years." With such an expansive scope, reach, and desire for universality in mind, Kollwitz's long struggle to realize the series can perhaps be better understood as a search for an extra-linguistic pictorial language, a kind of perfect expression that could translate her personal experience into a concept comprehensible by all humanity. And while the First World War led Kollwitz to wrestle with her views on patriotism, duty to one's country, and personal sacrifice, it was the death of her youngest son, Peter, on the Flemish front that instigated her long period of mourning, as well as propelled her to convey feelings about war in her work. At the onset of the war, Kollwitz's views towards Germany's military aspirations were in line with those of many liberal Germans. She found the violence of war barbaric, but admired the enthusiasm her sons and their friends felt for the fatherland, as she viewed their willingness to sacrifice for the relatively new nation as admirable and virtuous. As a result, she and her husband Karl reluctantly agreed to Peter's request to enlist, even though at age 18, he did not yet qualify for the compulsory draft. Kollwitz did not shy away from expressing her ambivalence about the war even before Peter's death. Like many other Berlin-based artists, particularly those associated with the Berlin Secession, Kollwitz published her work in Kriegszeit, a 4-page tabloid format weekly published by the Cassirer Gallery that featured war-related prints. Throughout the periodical's run from 1914 to 1916, only one of Kollwitz's drawings was featured in the publication. Originally entitled Waiting, the image showed a woman presumably waiting to hear news from the front. It ran with the new subtitle, Das Bangen, the German term for anticipatory fear. The images in Kriegszeit were predominantly nationalistic. Artists known for their liberal politics, such as Max Liebermann, drew morale-raising compositions featuring Prussian soldiers on horseback. Kollwitz's submission, an image of a woman with eyes closed, mouth shut, hands crossed, offered a stark contrast. Motionless, imbued with a sense of foreboding, the haunting study in tonal shading, executed with the soft lines of a chalk lithograph, diverged dramatically from the dynamism present in the expressionistic lines of Otto Whitner's mockingly grotesque drawing of the Russian Tsar Nicholas II from the front cover of the issue. Kollwitz's drawing for Krieg indicates she was actively thinking about what the unique role of women during wartime early on. The stillness of the woman, frozen in expectation of news from the trenches, sets up a dichotomy between the genders. As such, Kollwitz suggests that in war, men act while women wait. The image is thus not entirely a condemnation of war, but rather contains within it the suggestion that bravery takes an entirely different form for men and women, a point she observes in a diary entry from August 26, 1914. What does it do to women to send their loved ones, whose lives they have watched over most carefully, before the guns in the name of heroism? I fear that this upsurge of spirit comes in even darker despair and disheartenment. The task of women in times of war is to bear this, not only in the first weeks, but longer, in bleak November, even when spring comes again, in March, the month of young people who wanted to live and are now dead. Kollwitz's lithograph appears to reflect her own circumstances as a mother of 2 sons active in the German military forces. While she writes about the pride she feels for her sons' convictions and bravery in her diary, she also records the anxiety their involvement in the war has brought her in the form of nightmares. It is noteworthy to point out that Das Bangen ran in Kriegszeit only 2 days before Kollwitz learned of Peter's death. It is difficult to pinpoint the precise moment at which Kollwitz conceived of the idea to create a print cycle that expressed her thoughts on war. In January 1918, she wrote of the undertaking to her elder son, Hans. I have jumped into a project with both feet that I have envisioned since 1914, but had always pushed off. It now feels like a calling. Up to now, there have only been drawings. I have shown them to no one, and I wept as I drew them. Apart from the fact that I had not thought about working on prints for the next few years, there were 2 other reasons why I always postponed this plan. Firstly, the dread of letting out these most internal experiences, the feelings of these years, and then the feeling of the dilettantish nature of working in my studio compared to life, this life and death. Early versions of motifs and descriptions of related work in her diary and letters indicate the roots of the series can be found during the war years. In the earliest examples, however, it is not clear whether she had a print cycle in mind or if she was merely experimenting with subjects to find visual representation for the war. In a diary entry from October 1914, before Peter's death, she mentions a conversation she had with Hans about her struggle to find suitable imagery. She asserts, every form is already too outdated, too typical. Something so new should also find a new form of expression. This observation captures Kollwitz's struggle to produce publishable work during World War I and in the following years. Before executing Krieg as a woodcut cycle in the early 1920s, she abandoned attempts to realize it as a series of etchings and subsequently as lithographs. The woodcuts that served as the final impressions were executed from early 1921 to mid-1923. When the Krieg cycle was published in 1923, it consisted of the sacrifice, the volunteers, the parents, the widow 1, the widow 2, the mothers, and the people. The order of the series does not reflect the order in which the plates were created. In fact, the first and last plates, the sacrifice and the people, were the penultimate and final woodcuts to be completed. To an extent, they can be understood as bookends to the series. The parents, the widows 1 and 2, and the mothers evolved from plates created for the etched and lithographed versions. There was likely also a lithographed version of the second plate, the volunteers, although no examples are known to exist at present. Of the 7, this composition retains its biographical origins most clearly. At face value, the image is allegorical. Death leads the marching soldiers. Kollwitz, however, inserted a personal element into this composition by including a portrait of her son, Peter. In the catalog raisonné, Alexandra von dem Knesebeck notes that Kollwitz identified the soldiers with initials on an impression of the second state as Peter's friends: Erich Krems, Walter Meyer, and Julius Heuer, all of whom were killed during the war. These young men shared the same ideals and willingness to sacrifice for the greater good of the German nation. They had grown up in a culture that promoted love of country, an ideology with origins that can be traced back to the Napoleonic Wars of the 19th century. Many young men of Peter's generation involved in the youth movement were influenced by a treatise written by the German idealist philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte, titled Addresses to the German Nation from 1808. Fichte advocated in favor of German nationalism prior to German unification and praised the virtues of the German people. The third plate in the series, The Parents, has the longest traceable history of the 7 motifs. In December 1914, a little over a month after Peter's death, Kollwitz began developing ideas for a memorial to her fallen son. In its earliest iteration, she envisioned a sculpture of his body lying on a pedestal, with his parents in mourning, the figure of a mother at the feet, and the father at the head. Only these photographs remain as evidence of the original plaster models. There's no photograph of the father. For the lithographic version of Krieg, which she had worked on in the years just after the war, she developed a motif derived from a sketch she had made of her parents at Christmas. In her diary from December 1917, she mentions redrawing this motif. The original sketch, which she dates to 1915 or possibly earlier, depicts an older man and woman seated in armchairs that flank a Christmas tree. From the humorless expressions on the parents' faces, it seems reasonable to assume that Kollwitz produced the drawing in the years shortly after Peter's death. She created at least 12 drawings that relate to this subject, some of which are dated to 1915 and others to 1917. As Alexandra von dem Knesebeck has traced through diary entries and personal letters, the lithographic version of the parents was executed in the beginning of 1919. Here, the features of the parents are more fully realized than in the sketches. The spatial and temporal context of the drawings, the armchair and Christmas tree, however, has been removed. Both figures sit with their hands in their laps. The mother is drawn facing forward and the father is shown in profile. Kollwitz created another image of the mourning parents again in April 1920, redrawing it with the figures bent over one another. The mother rests her head on the father's left forearm as he lays his head down on her back. The composition of the figures in the woodcut plate is resonant with the second lithograph version. As the parents' facial features are no longer visible, the figures become less portrait-like and more archetypal. The trial proofs indicate how Kollwitz worked towards refining the motifs in her woodcuts. In each of the 5 states of the woodcut, she carefully added detail in a piecemeal manner. Between the first and second states, the drapery of the mother's dress becomes more defined. From the third to the fourth, she delineated the father's jacket and shoes with a few added cuts in the wood. Although it is from this block that she realized the impression published in the portfolio, she began recarving the motif in a new block in December 1922, claiming that the original plate was much too light and stiff and clear. Pain is very dark. She ultimately changed her mind about the first version and abandoned the second block. The fourth and fifth plates in Krieg feature widows. Unlike the artist herself, the women depicted in these plates are members of the working class. More so than any other artist active in the early 20th century Berlin, Kollwitz was acutely aware of the struggles of the lower classes as she and her family lived among factory workers in the neighborhood of Prenzlauer Berg, an area in the northeast corner of Berlin developed to house the influx of laborers as the city rapidly industrialized. Her husband was a physician for the families that lived there. Between the mid-19th and early 20th centuries, Berlin expanded from a city of roughly 400,000 people to a metropolis of 2 million, with an additional 1.5 million inhabitants living in the growing suburbs around it. In spite of the difference in circumstances between Kollwitz and her neighbors, she was a presence in the lives of the women she encountered in her building. She advocated for social welfare causes and looked to the people around her for subjects for her work. Kollwitz recorded in her diary numerous stories of working-class women who were struggling to survive during the war years because their husbands were either fighting on the front or had been killed in combat. In an entry from February 23, 1916, she recorded how the women modeling often spoke of their husband's death. One spoke of how her husband had died and then the subsequent death of both of her children from diphtheria in the following week. Such stories of physical exhaustion and anguish likely inspired Kollwitz to develop motifs such as Killed in Action, a plate from the abandoned lithograph series, and the various iterations of Widow 1. The original versions of the Widow differed distinctly in tone from the final impression executed as a woodcut. The intaglio print and the lithograph offer frontal views of pregnant women. Their faces register desperation and depression, and their eyes are open. Their affect is externally directed. By contrast, the woodcut shows a more introspective figure. The woman turns her head to the side and her eyes are closed. Executed in 1921 and early 1922, her posture is more closely related to two lithographs Kollwitz created in 1920, both titled Pensive Woman. The widow's hands in the woodcut are oversized, as in the lithographs, though they rest on her abdomen rather than on her forehead to emphasize her pregnancy. In a diary entry from May 17, 1915, Kollwitz discussed the prevalence of suicide among the widows of war veterans, citing a specific example of a woman who had drowned herself. This event possibly inspired the motif for Widow 2. In the original lithograph version of this plate, the woman's figure is surrounded by water. She crosses her arms over the child on her chest. In the first state impression of the woodcut, vestiges of this initial composition can be detected in the ripple-like patterning on the surface on which the woman's body lies. The shadow cast by her form, however, suggests that the surface is solid. In the process of refining the impression, Kollwitz eliminated this texture, in addition to the profile of a flickering candle in the background. In the final state, the seventh, Kollwitz elongated the woodblock by 12.5 centimeters in order to show the woman's entire body. The final impression thus bears a strikingly different tone from the original lithograph. The lithograph demonstrates Kollwitz's talent for drawing, certainly. The delicately described profile of the dead woman's parted lips and graceful arms crossed over the infant's body to reveal only an invitingly round skull imbue the composition with a beauty that is disconsonant with the brutality of the subject. From Kollwitz's description of the work from December 1917, it appears evident that such a romanticized depiction of death was intentional initially. She writes, "Devised a plan today, probably for a new etching, the young woman drifting in water with a child on her body. Only tones, dark flowing water, body contour, her head is the focal point, she smiles, proud, silent, otherworldly." This language recalls the symbolist undertones of some of Kollwitz's earlier work, influenced by Max Klinger. In the woodcut, however, Kollwitz banished all elements that provide the viewer with aesthetic pleasure. The corpse is laid bare, exposing the devastation of war in all its wretchedness. Much of the satisfaction Kollwitz felt towards the woodcut version of Krieg can arguably be attributed to the process of distillation it brought to the motifs she had begun to develop during the war and the years that immediately followed. In reducing sketches and grayscale lithographs to the black and white palette of the woodcut, she derived from her very personal experience of loss images that were more broadly accessible. Kollwitz's choice to abandon the lithograph series and experiment with woodcuts was motivated by work she had seen by fellow printmaker and sculptor Ernst Barlach at the Berlin Secession exhibition in June 24, 1920. When one compares the final impressions of the Krieg cycle to Barlach's work, however, it is clear that Kollwitz found her own style soon after beginning her work in the medium. Whereas Barlach's image of a kneeling woman with a dying child from 1919, a subject not unlike the Widow 2 in its conception, it relies on a dynamic web of carved lines. Kollwitz's figure, in contrast, emerges from the darkness of a rich black surface. Barlach clearly looked to the tradition of the woodcut in Germanic art and the work of the old masters. Kollwitz instead engaged with form, creating entirely unprecedented sculptural forms. Like Widow 1, the sixth plate, The Mothers, was realized in 3 media as an etching, lithograph, and woodcut. When Kollwitz sketched this composition, she arranged the figures in a frieze-like configuration, such that they created a phalanx of mothers protecting their children. Kollwitz applied the spatial organization of the figures in the etched and lithographed versions of the plate. Among the abandoned lithographs, this was the only plate with which she was satisfied. For the woodcut, however, Kollwitz began to think of the group of mothers and children three-dimensionally. In her diary, she commented that it was the same motif as with the lithograph, but compositionally more concentrated. Before working on the woodblock, Kollwitz created a preparatory drawing in India ink to translate the grayscale lithograph into a black and white image. To edit the design, she painted over particular sections in white gouache, or opaque watercolor, as she did when making hand edits to trial proofs. In other areas, she made incisions in the paper to insert new figures on scraps of paper added to the initial sheet. Rather than create a new sketch, she manipulated the material support rather than the line. The existence of India ink drawings of other plates in the Krieg cycle suggests that this was a critical step for Kollwitz in conceiving of her woodcut compositions. Kollwitz created the first and final plates in the cycle, the sacrifice and the people, last. She thus developed these motifs with an awareness of the content and sequence of the intermediary plates. These plates are instructive in understanding Kollwitz's own process of grappling with the war and her emergent pacifism. The sacrifice introduces the woodcut cycle with an image that is at once allegorical and personal. In the plate, a naked woman with eyes shut offers her child as a sacrifice. To a certain extent, she represents all mothers, and in the particular context of war, the mothers of sons serving on the front. The plate also references Kollwitz's personal tragedy and the death of her son. The use of the term Opfer, the German word for sacrifice, has historical significance, as it was a concept that was in the ether in the late summer of 1914. Kollwitz refers to Peter's decision to enlist as this sacrifice which he forced on me and which we force on Karl. The young men active in the youth movement often spoke of the patriotic duty to sacrifice for one's country. In late August 1914, the novelist and proponent of the women's movement, Gabriele Reuter, published an article in which she extolled the ecstatic nature of sacrifice. Moreover, it is the selfless notion of sacrifice as a virtue that Kollwitz invokes repeatedly in her diary shortly after Peter's death, as a means of finding some redemption in such a profound loss. By 1918, she saw his death as senseless, asking herself in her diary, what then has happened? The sacrifice of our young men themselves and our own sacrifice. Can things not remain as they were? The shifting connotation of the term Opfer for Kollwitz throughout the war thus suggests a complexity within the relative simplicity of this motif. Insofar as the first plate introduces the premise, as Kollwitz sees it, on which the participation in the war was justified in 1914, and problem as this ideology was revealed to be baseless. The final plate in the series, The People, looks to the period after the war by offering an image of the survivors. A woman protecting a child in her cloak looks outward. Behind her stand tormented masses, physically disfigured and visibly distraught. Kollwitz's choice to conclude the series with such an image is manifold. After having systematically dedicated the individual plates to the suffering of specific subgroups within the population, The People asserts that all of humanity bears the devastation of war. Moreover, the broad reach of the last plate gestures towards the great ambitions Kollwitz had for the cycle, to be seen by people all over the world and to promote peace. Before World War I, Käthe Kollwitz had expressed her allegiance with workers' movements and concern for the less fortunate in her art, yet resisted aligning herself with particular political movements. The experience of living through the war and the personal loss she suffered moved her to become a vocal and public proponent of pacifism. To this end, she looked to the Krieg cycle to publicize her anti-war message. In addition to the A and B editions, Kollwitz approved the preparation of electrotype plates from the original blocks in 1924 for the production of a popular edition that would be less expensive and thus available to a broader public. In August 1924, A decade after the onset of World War I, she exhibited the 7 woodcut plates alongside prints from the 1924 portfolio of 50 etchings, also titled Krieg, by Otto Dix, and graphic photographs taken on the front at an exhibition organized by the founder of the Anti-War Museum, Ernst Friedrich. As the museum did not open to the public until October 1st, 1925, this exhibition would have been held in a youth center on Kochheimstrasse in the Friedrichshain neighborhood of Berlin. After publishing the Krieg cycle, Kollwitz was invited to create poster designs for the anti-war organizations. In late 1922, the Amsterdam-based International Trade Union Congress invited her to design a poster that promoted pacifism. Kollwitz wrote to Erna Kruger that this was the kind of work she had envisioned for herself. While she does not go so far as to call it activist art, she writes, "Let people say 1,000 times that art with a purpose is not pure art. I, for my part, want to be affective with my art for as long as I am able to work." Kollwitz initially wanted to adapt a motif from the Mothers, but the organizers expressed a preference for an image of survivors that depicted a broader swath of the population. She returned to the final plate, The People, for inspiration. She sketched a portrait and landscape format design for the survivors, in which she explored how to add additional figures to her earlier composition. The posters were disseminated throughout Europe, with the text appearing in Swedish, as seen here, German, Danish, and Dutch. In 1924, Kollwitz designed a poster for the Central German Youth Day, which was sponsored by the pacifist organization Nie wieder Krieg, Never Again War. Held in Leipzig on August 1st, the 10-year anniversary of the onset of World War I, the day consisted of anti-war rallies and speeches. The dynamic design for this poster and the vehemence of its message serve as a dramatic contrast to the figures that populate the plates from the Krieg cycle. Instead of static victims of war, Kollwitz presents the viewer with youth, head uplifted and arm high in the air, full of unrepentant bombast and promise. The influence of the motifs from the Krieg cycle can be seen in numerous examples of Kollwitz's work from the 1920s, 30s, and even shortly before her death in the 40s. The 2 statues Kollwitz designed for Peter's memorial clearly relate to the third plate in the series, The Parents. When Kollwitz resumed work on the sculptures in 1924, after Krieg had been published, she no longer included Peter's body in her design, limiting the forms to the constellation to those of the mourning parents, as in the woodcut. From the models for the figures executed at this time, we can see that she chose to separate the mother and father, again, as in the lithograph. The final life-size granite sculptures were executed based on Kollwitz's designs in the early 1930s and installed in the Rochefeld German Military Cemetery in 1932. They were moved to their current location in the German Veterans Cemetery in Blaslo, in Flanders, where the graves were relocated in 1956. The persistence of Kollwitz's emblems of peace is particularly remarkable considering their prevalence after Adolf Hitler assumed power in 1933. In spite of having been forced to leave her position at the Prussian Academy of Arts, where she had served as the first female department head since 1927, she continued to work in a studio on Kloster Street in Berlin. Much like the assertive force of the figure in the Nie wieder Krieg poster, much of Kollwitz's work created under Hitler's regime evolved towards greater impudence in the face of fascism. In 1937-38, she created a small sculpture conceived as a 3-dimensional realization of the Mothers, the 6th plate from Krieg. The women depicted in the sculpture, titled Tower of Mothers, however, were realized in a more aggressive stance of resistance. While the women in the woodcut actively shield the others behind her, while the women in the woodcut huddle to protect their children, the central figure in the sculpture actively shields the others behind her. From inside the tower, a fist rises up in defiance. Nazi officials removed it from a small exhibition on Kloster Street on the grounds that it implied the state was not providing adequate protection for the nation's youth. Her last lithograph from 1941 is equally antagonistic vis-a-vis the politics of the National Socialist state. The form of the old woman protecting the children under her cloak is again derived from the motif developed in the woodcut version of the mothers. Kollwitz chose to title the lithograph, "Seeds for Planting Must Not Be Ground," after a quotation from the novel Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship by the German literary great Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Kollwitz first invoked this quote during World War I in reference to her son's death. She used it again to conclude her response to Richard Damel's appeal to German soldiers to fight to the bitter end. On October 30th, 1918, her words, "Enough have died, no more shall perish. In opposition to Richard Damel, I invoke a greater author who said, 'Seeds for sowing must not be ground,'" appeared in the Social Democratic newspaper Vorwärts. By returning to this line, penned by Germany's greatest literary figure in the middle of World War II, Kollwitz reasserted her anti-war convictions at a time when such opinions were dangerous to hold. Käthe Kollwitz, sadly, did not live to see peace again in her time. The war in Europe would continue for another 2 weeks after her death on April 22nd, 1945. Considering the historical circumstances at the end of Kollwitz's life, it is perhaps easy to feel pessimistic about the lofty goals she had for her art. In spite of her efforts to show the world the pernicious toxicity of war, Germany had entered yet another conflict, even more notorious than World War I. And yet, Kollwitz's art has an enduring quality that transcends the specific time and place in which it was made. In the Yonker collection of propaganda art at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., there are multiple examples of graphic designs by unknown artists that incorporate Kollwitz's motifs, particularly those bearing anti-war messages. Gary Yanker assembled the collection between 1965 and 1980 in 56 countries, though most of the material comes from the United States. Among the posters is a screen print featuring the youth from Kollwitz's Central German Youth Day poster, paired with the great text, "Never Again War," in day-glow pink. This poster was likely made in protest of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. In spite of the nearly half-century separating Kollwitz's original and the poster from the 1960s or 70s, this appropriated image of brazen conviction and passion for peace remained meaningful and continues to resonate with viewers today. Considering Kollwitz's emphasis on the effectiveness of her art, it would seem that she would have been pleased to know of the existence of such work, conveying the message of pacifism to a population in another language, in another country, at a different time through the powerful images. I thank you, and if you have any questions, please feel free.
It's all up to you. Right.
Yes?
Two questions. One, did she paint?
She did not really paint. She, very early on in her career, she tried to sort of train as a painter, but really what was available to female artists at the time was drawing school, and she felt that she didn't really have a talent for painting. So she painted a few pictures for her father, who tried to sell them, but really didn't go very far. I think she really saw herself as a printmaker, and then also as a sculptor later in her career.
Question two.
Yes.
Did she know Goya's etchings?
She would have been familiar with them, but I don't think they're directly.
Disasters of war.
Yeah, but they're not directly referenced in her work. I think she's much more concerned with sort of what's happening in the mundane, rather than on the battlefront, which I think is the real difference with Kollwitz. And certainly, I think more ties can be made between Otto Dix's war series and Goya's Disasters of War than with Kollwitz's war series.
In The Widow 2 is the child that's laying on.
Can you wait just a moment? I'm going to hand you a mic. In The Widow 2, is the child that's laying on the mother supposed to also be dead, or is it still alive?
I think it's not entirely clear. But I think the implication that she's making with that kind of a motif is that this sort of the idea of sort of living beyond, sort of once a woman's been widowed and has lost her husband on the front, in the circumstances that the poor were living in Berlin, there was no real future for the woman, and there was no real future for her children because she had lost her means of support. I think the men in particular that were conscripted from these rental barracks were referred to as cannon fodder because they were sort of the least educated, the poorest people, and they were seen as sort of expendable by the German military. So the first people to die were the poorest people in Germany. And for women, there really weren't that many options. And one of the sort of social causes that Kollwitz was particularly vocal about was about homework, or the sort of handicraft work that women were engaging with after they had already put their families to bed, that they would work by candlelight, sort of doing sort of stitching. And so she created posters for these exhibitions that were meant to sort of show the upper middle class of Berlin the origins of the things that they were buying at low cost. That this was being low cost because it was sort of on the backs of these impoverished women who were working 24 hours a day, essentially. Yes?
We have this remarkable woman. Oh gosh. We have this remarkable woman, but in context, just in an overall or arching lunar picture, was she the only one? Was she influenced by other women? Were other women artists influenced by her within this period?
There were other women who attended drawing school with her because it was actually a school for women. But I think there were very few women who achieved this level of prominence in German society at the time. The other sort of notable female artist is Paula Modersohn-Becker, but she died quite young. So she did not have sort of this long career that Kollwitz had. So there certainly were other women, and she had friendships with female artists like Anna Kruger. But in terms of people with the name recognition like Kollwitz, not so much. I mean, I think Kollwitz is known by some in the United States, but in Germany, she's a household name. There are 2 museums dedicated to her work. Her work appears on stamps. It's all over the country, and it's somebody that everybody in Germany knows.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I was curious on the grave sites of the German war dead, or in other countries in Europe in World War I.
I was just curious, in the grave sites in the German cemeteries, the French and the British cemeteries, how did they use sculpture in terms of recognizing their lost loved ones? I mean, because prior to World War I didn't think they had that much sculpture. It was always heroic sculpture of sacrifice, but it changed during the 20th century, or the early, part of during the World War I, after World War I.
Well, I mean, certainly for Germany, I mean, the whole prevalence of sort of large sculpture in public spaces in Germany, at least coming out of the 19th century, really starts exploding after unification, because it's all sort of there to glorify and create this notion of a unified Germany. So there's just suddenly this explosion of sculptures of Otto von Bismarck in every single German city. And you're right, sort of in general, when you think about what large sculpture in public spaces means in Europe, it's generally sort of a celebration of the state, or in some ways, or memorialization of sort of large numbers of soldiers that had died. I think most recently I was in Brussels about a month ago, and there's a large sculpture in front of the main city hall to the lost soldiers of World War I. This is a very unique looking sculpture, and it's very modernist in its appearance. And the way that Kollwitz initially planned to have it installed, you would walk in, and so you would see them from behind, and the graves would be in front of you, so that the parents are both looking over the graves, and you are put into their vantage point. And then when you leave, you sort of see them looking back at the loss. So it was actually very carefully thought out. That's not exactly what it looks like now in Władysław. It was not reinstalled exactly in keeping with her initial plans for it. But I think it's pretty unique and singular in terms of the type of sculpture that you would find in a German war cemetery. I don't know exactly. I imagine it has something to do with World War II, because although it's in the early 50s, so I don't know the specific reasons for why it was relocated. But I will say, the Belgians are very proud of these sculptures. So I was in Belgium leading a patrons trip for the Davis Museum, and we would thank our various tour guides at various museums by giving them a copy of the catalog, which felt kind of heavy. We would say, we have to like hear the catalog in Käthe Kollwitz. And the Belgians were immediately excited because they said, well, do you know we have sculptures by Käthe Kollwitz? They're right up here. They're in Wellesley. And I said, yes, there's an entire chapter on that. You will enjoy this catalog. But it's clearly meaningful to them that it exists.
Were any of the images in the mother's self-portrait?
I would say yes and no. I mean, I feel like most people, when they look at Kollwitz's women, you always feel like you sort of see her staring back at you. And yet, they weren't, in no point in her diaries does she say that she's creating a self-portrait. Although, as an artist, she creates many self-portraits throughout her career. And the one that I showed sort of while I was talking about the beginning of the series is from 1915. It was one that she created for an exhibition at the Stedelijk. So it's shortly after the death of her son, but always intended for sort of a public audience.
What is the significance of her using enlarged hands in her works?
I mean, what precisely is the significance, I don't entirely know. I think it implies a certain capability and sturdiness that the female figures all have these really oversized hands. And she generally portrays the mothers in this series as sort of corralling the children and being the protectors. And I think also it sort of creates more this idea of sort of the protectiveness that she is sort of serving as this Madonna-like figure, that they're sort of under her cloak. This is something that Henriette discusses in her essay. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much for coming and listening to my talk. I hope you enjoyed it.